August 17th, 1943, 14:28 hours, 27,000 feet over Schweinfurt, Germany. Lieutenant Colonel Curtis LeMay watched from lead B-17 Flying Fortress as German flak batteries opened fire on his formation of 230 bombers approaching ball-bearing factories that supplied 40% of Germany's war production. Black smoke bursts filled sky around his aircraft, creating lethal pattern that pilots called Flak Alley. Behind him, in tight formation, 19 other B-17s maintained position, despite shells exploding close enough to rock aircraft with concussion. The formation, called Combat Box, concentrated defensive firepower from 200-plus machine guns, making it mathematically suicidal for German fighters to press home attacks. LeMay had problem that was strategically absolute. His mission, destroying Schweinfurt ball-bearing plants deep inside Germany, required penetrating 400 miles beyond friendly lines through heaviest concentration of German air defenses in Europe. He had no fighter escort. American fighters lacked range to reach Schweinfurt, leaving bombers defenseless for final 200 miles of approach and egress. German forces knew bombers were unescorted, making this mission opportunity for Luftwaffe to inflict catastrophic losses that might stop American daylight bombing campaign entirely. The mathematics said, unsustainable. 8th Air Force had sustained 20% loss rates on previous deep penetration missions, 1 in 5 bombers destroyed. At 20% losses per mission, bomber crews' probability of surviving required 25 mission tour was approximately 3%, meaning 97% of crews would be killed or captured before completing tour. These statistics violated every military principle about acceptable casualty rates, yet LeMay's orders were explicit. Press attack regardless of losses because ball-bearing production was critical German vulnerability that precision bombing could exploit. LeMay made decision in approximately 5 seconds that would define American strategic bombing doctrine for remainder of war. He would maintain tight formation regardless of losses because concentrated defensive firepower was only protection bombers had against German fighters. He would continue straight and level bombing run despite flak because evasive maneuvers would disperse formation, eliminating defensive firepower concentration. He would accept today's casualties, believing that sustained attacks over months would force Germany to divert resources to air defense, weakening their ability to fight ground war in Russia and eventually in France. Think about that calculation. August 1943. Flying unescorted through German airspace in aircraft that Luftwaffe commanders had initially mocked as too slow, too vulnerable, too impractical for deep penetration missions. German fighter tactics had evolved specifically to counter B-17 formations, massed frontal attacks exploiting fortresses' weak nose armament, rocket attacks from beyond defensive gun range, coordinated attacks from multiple axes overwhelming gunners' ability to track threats. Yet LeMay was betting 2,300 American lives, 10 crewmen per bomber times 230 bombers, that B-17's defensive firepower and structural toughness would enable bombers to reach target, destroy it, and return, despite losses that would be catastrophic. What LeMay didn't know as his formation approached Schweinfurt was that this single mission, First Schweinfurt raid, would cost 36 bombers destroyed and 27 damaged beyond repair, representing 27% loss rate that was mathematically unsustainable for continuing operations. That survivors would limp back to England with dead and wounded aboard, with engines shot out, with control surfaces shredded, demonstrating both B-17's legendary toughness and the extreme cost of unescorted deep penetration missions. What LeMay didn't know was that within weeks, 8th Air Force would temporarily suspend deep penetration missions until long-range escort fighters became available, acknowledging that bombers alone, despite their defensive firepower, couldn't sustain losses required for strategic bombing campaign. That this suspension would validate German commanders' initial assessment that American daylight precision bombing was impractical given defensive advantages that defenders enjoyed over unescorted bombers. What LeMay didn't know was that when long-range P-51 Mustang escorts became available in early 1944, B-17 formations with fighter protection would achieve loss rates below 5%, making strategic bombing campaigns sustainable. That transformation from unsustainable 20+% losses to sustainable sub-5% losses would prove that bombers required fighter escort rather than being able to fight through to targets using only defensive firepower as pre-war doctrine had assumed. What LeMay didn't know was that B-17 production would total 12,731 aircraft by war's end, making it most produced heavy bomber in American history. That B-17s would drop 640,000 tons of bombs on European targets, more tonnage than any other American aircraft. That 4,735 B-17s would be lost in combat, but that majority of 85,000 plus crewmen who flew B-17s would survive war, demonstrating that despite horrific losses, crew survival rate in B-17s exceeded survival rates in lighter bombers due to aircraft's structural toughness and defensive armament. What LeMay didn't know was that German cities targeted by B-17 formations would experience destruction exceeding anything European warfare had previously produced. That Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, Cologne would see entire city districts obliterated by concentrated bombing, demonstrating that precision daylight bombing, when executed in sufficient mass, could achieve strategic effects that pre-war air power theorists had predicted, but that many practitioners had doubted were achievable. What LeMay didn't know was that post-war strategic bombing surveys would debate whether damage inflicted justified casualties sustained and resources expended. That surveys would conclude that strategic bombing was essential for Allied victory, but that precision daylight bombing achieved less precision than claimed, and that many targets bombed repeatedly maintained production through dispersal and underground facilities. That this debate would continue for 8 decades, with partisans arguing that strategic bombing was war-winning strategy versus those arguing it was costly diversion from more effective ground operations. What LeMay didn't know was that his own career trajectory would demonstrate both bombing campaigns' effectiveness and its moral complications. That he would rise from colonel to major general in 3 years based on bombing operations success. That he would command firebombing of Japan in 1945, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians, creating moral questions about targeting decisions. That, he would later state, "I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal," acknowledging that strategic bombing pushed boundaries of acceptable warfare. What LeMay didn't know was that B-17 crews' experiences, 26% killed, 30% captured, 44% surviving, would create post-war generation of veterans who carried psychological burdens from sustained combat flying missions where death was statistical probability rather than remote possibility. That many crews would develop what would later be recognized as PTSD from watching adjacent bombers explode, from seeing crew members killed, from knowing each mission might be fatal. That this psychological toll would be inadequately addressed for decades because post-war culture expected veterans to resume normal lives without acknowledging combat's lasting psychological effects. The mathematics of destruction were being written in bomb tonnage and loss rates and production disruption that would prove that heavy bombers could achieve strategic effects when employed in sufficient mass with adequate fighter escort, despite defenders' technological and tactical advantages. And those mathematics would demonstrate that strategic bombing was neither war-winning silver bullet that pre-war theorists promised, nor futile waste of resources that critics claimed, but rather costly complement to ground operations that contributed to victory while consuming vast resources and human lives.
By time LeMay's formation reached bomb release point over Schweinfurt, 2,300 men flying through flak and fighter attacks, with survival probability decreasing each minute they remained over target, transformation from theoretical concept of precision strategic bombing to brutal reality of sustained attrition warfare had occurred, and calculation that destroying Germany's industrial capacity justified accepting casualties that would horrify ground force commanders had been made not through careful strategic analysis, but through desperation, believing that sustained pressure from air would eventually break Germany's ability to wage war. 1935 to 1938. 8 years before Schweinfurt,
American air power theorists at Air Corps Tactical School developed doctrine of precision daylight strategic bombing that would drive B-17 development and deployment. Air Corps Tactical School Doctrine Manual dated 1935, preserved at Air Force Historical Research Agency, outlined theoretical framework for strategic bombing. According to doctrine, modern industrial warfare creates vulnerabilities that air power can exploit. Industrial economies require functioning factories producing weapons, transportation networks moving materials, power generation providing electricity, critical resources like oil and steel. These constitute industrial web, whose disruption cripples war-making capacity. Strategic bombing can destroy critical nodes in industrial web, achieving effects disproportionate to effort expended. Key principle: precision bombing of specific targets is more effective than indiscriminate area bombing because destroying critical facilities like ball-bearing factories affects entire industrial system, while destroying residential areas merely creates civilian suffering without corresponding military effect. This doctrine reflected Air Corps' institutional interests in demonstrating that air power could win wars independently, rather than merely supporting ground forces. Doctrine's implicit argument was that if strategic bombing could destroy enemies' war-making capacity, ground invasions might become unnecessary, making Air Corps co-equal service rather than auxiliary to army. Doctrine's key assumptions were: bombers flying at high altitude could evade enemy fighters, bomber defensive firepower would deter fighter attacks that occurred, precision bombing could destroy specific factories from high altitude using advanced bomb sites, and sustained bombing campaign would force enemy to negotiate rather than face industrial collapse. These assumptions would prove partially correct and partially wrong. Bombers could reach targets but not without heavy losses. Defensive firepower deterred some attacks but not all. Precision bombing could destroy factories when weather permitted, but accuracy was lower than doctrine assumed, and sustained bombing contributed to victory but didn't force negotiation without simultaneous ground campaigns. B-17 Flying Fortress design reflected strategic bombing doctrine. Boeing's proposal, dated 1934, specified 4-engine heavy bomber, high-altitude capability, 25,000 plus feet, heavy defensive armament, initially 5 machine guns, later increased to 13, precision bomb sight, Norden bomb sight, range sufficient for deep penetration missions, 2,000 plus miles, and structural strength allowing sustained combat operations. Prototype Boeing Model 299 first flew July 28, 1935, demonstrating capabilities that impressed Army evaluators. According to test report, Model 299 achieves 236 mph maximum speed, operates effectively at 25,000 feet altitude, carries 4,800 pounds bomb load, range 2,000 miles. Defensive armament provides protection from multiple attack axes. Preliminary assessment: aircraft meets strategic bombing requirements and demonstrates potential for effective deep penetration missions against defended targets. 1939 to 1941. European War, beginning September 1939, provided reality check for American strategic bombing doctrine, as British experience demonstrated that unescorted daylight bombing suffered catastrophic losses against determined fighter opposition. Royal Air Force Bombing Operations report dated December 1939 documented early lessons. According to report, RAF has attempted daylight bombing raids against German naval installations using Wellington and Hampton bombers. Results have been disastrous. December 18th, mission: 12 Wellington bombers attacked German naval base at Wilhelmshaven. German Bf-109 and Bf-110 fighters intercepted formation. 5 Wellingtons destroyed, 2 crashed landing back in England. Only 5 returned undamaged. Loss rate 58%. Conclusion: daylight bombing without fighter escort against defended targets is unsustainable. RAF will transition to night bombing operations where darkness provides protection that defensive armament cannot. This British experience should have caused Americans to reconsider daylight bombing doctrine. Instead, Americans argued that British bombers lacked sufficient defensive armament and that B-17 with heavier guns and better formation tactics could succeed where British bombers failed. Army Air Corps Combat Evaluation, dated March 1940, assessed British experience. According to evaluation, British losses reflect inadequate defensive armament and poor formation discipline. American bombers with superior defensive firepower concentrated through tight formation flying can achieve what British bombers cannot. B-17 carries 10 machine guns versus Wellington's 6 guns. American combat box formation concentrates firepower from multiple bombers, creating defensive sphere that German fighters cannot penetrate. Recommendation: proceed with strategic bombing doctrine as planned, using improved tactics that British have not employed. This assessment reflected institutional commitment to doctrine rather than objective analysis of evidence. British losses demonstrated fundamental problem. Bombers, regardless of defensive armament, were vulnerable to dedicated fighter opposition. But American Air Corps had invested heavily in strategic bombing doctrine and B-17 production, making doctrinal revision institutionally difficult. First combat test of American strategic bombing doctrine occurred August 17,
1942, exactly 1 year before Schweinfurt, when 12 B-17s attacked Rouen-Sotteville rail yards in France. Mission was successful with minor losses, demonstrating that against light opposition, B-17 formations performed as doctrine predicted. But Rouen was shallow penetration mission 100 miles into France with fighter escort available, rather than deep penetration mission into Germany that doctrine envisioned. August 17, 1943. First Schweinfurt raid, launched exactly 1 year after first B-17 combat mission, would demonstrate costs and limits of unescorted deep penetration strategic bombing. Mission plan dated August 15, 1943, outlined objectives and force composition.
According to plan, target: Schweinfurt ball-bearing plants producing 40% of German ball-bearing production. Ball bearings are a critical component for all machinery, including aircraft, tanks, vehicles. Destroying Schweinfurt plants will create bottleneck in German production. Force: 230 B-17s from multiple bomb groups. Route: penetrate German airspace from Belgium, fly 200 miles unescorted through Germany to target, bomb from 27,000 feet, return 200 miles unescorted. Fighter escort: P-47. Thunderbolts will escort to German border but lack range to reach Schweinfurt. Bombers will be unescorted for final 400 miles round trip. Expected losses: 10–15% acceptable for target value. This plan accepted that bombers would face German fighters without escort for critical portion of mission. Gamble that B-17 defensive firepower and formation tactics would enable bombers to fight through opposition. German response exceeded American planning assumptions. According to Luftwaffe action report dated August 17, 1943, American bomber formation detected approaching Schweinfurt at 1400 hours. Luftwaffe deployed 300-plus single-engine fighters, Bf-109, Fw-190, 40-plus twin-engine fighters, Bf-110, Me-410. Tactics: mass frontal attacks exploiting weak nose armament on B-17, rocket attacks from beyond defensive gun range, vertical attacks from above exploiting limited top turret traverse, coordinated attacks from multiple axes overwhelming gunner capacity to engage multiple threats simultaneously. Total sorties: approximately 500 fighter sorties against 230 bombers, more than 2.1 fighter advantage. German fighters concentrated attacks during unescorted portions of route. According to American after-action report, fighter opposition intense from German border to target and return. Bf-109s and Fw-190s conducted massed frontal attacks. Formations of 20-30 fighters attacking head-on, exploiting B-17's weak nose armament, which typically consisted of 2 machine guns versus 10 guns, protecting sides and rear. These frontal attacks forced our formations to endure sustained fire from closing fighters before defensive guns could engage effectively. Additionally, Me-410s launched rocket attacks from 1,000 yards range, beyond effective range of our defensive guns, firing rockets that destroyed B-17s without attacking aircraft entering our defensive fire zone. Results were catastrophic. According to mission summary, of 230 B-17s dispatched, 36 destroyed over Germany, 27 damaged beyond economical repair, crashed or written off after return, 95 damaged but repairable, 72 undamaged. Total losses: 63 aircraft representing 27% loss rate. Crew casualties: 360 killed or missing, 47 wounded. Target damage assessment: significant damage to ball-bearing plants with estimated 35% production capacity destroyed. Analysis: target damage achieved, but at loss rate that is mathematically unsustainable for continued operations. At 27% losses per mission, statistical crew survival probability for 25 mission tour is less than 1%. This loss rate forced strategic reassessment. 8th Air Force Commander General Ira Eaker's report, dated August 20, 1943, stated, First Schweinfurt demonstrates that deep penetration missions without fighter escort sustain unacceptable losses. While target was successfully attacked, 27% loss rate cannot be sustained. Recommend: suspend deep penetration missions until long-range escort fighters become available, or develop alternative tactics reducing losses to sustainable levels below 10%. Strategic bombing campaign cannot continue at current casualty rates without exhausting trained crews faster than replacements can be trained. October 14, 1943. Despite First Schweinfurt's losses, 8th Air Force launched Second Schweinfurt raid, October 14, 1943, mission that would become known as Black Thursday, due to losses that finally forced suspension of unescorted deep penetration missions. Mission plan was similar to August raid, 291 B-17s attacking Schweinfurt, unescorted for 400 miles round trip, anticipating heavy opposition but judging target value justified risk. According to mission plan, ball-bearing production at Schweinfurt has recovered to approximately 70% capacity following August raid. Second attack will create sustained disruption, forcing Germans to disperse production, reducing efficiency. Expected losses: 15 to 20% anticipated, given German knowledge of our tactics from August raid. German response was even more effective than August. According to Luftwaffe report, American formation again attacked Schweinfurt October 14th. Luftwaffe deployed approximately 350 fighters, employing refined tactics developed after August raid. Key innovations: larger frontal attack formations, 30-40 fighters, improved rocket tactics with Me-410s attacking from longer range, coordinated attacks from multiple axes simultaneously preventing American gunners from concentrating fire, and attacks on damaged bombers that had lost formation position, making them vulnerable targets. Results were worse than First Schweinfurt. According to mission summary, of 291 B-17s dispatched, 60 destroyed over Germany, 17 crashed or written off after return, 121 damaged but repairable, 93 undamaged. Total losses: 77 aircraft representing 26% loss rate, crew casualties 600 plus killed or missing, 65 wounded. Combined with First Schweinfurt, 140 bombers lost in 2 missions against single target. Analysis: target damage achieved with Schweinfurt capacity reduced to approximately 50%, but losses make continued operations impossible without fighter escort. General Hap Arnold's memo dated October 16, 1943, suspended deep penetration operations. Second Schweinfurt confirms that unescorted strategic bombing cannot be sustained at current loss rates, effective immediately. Suspend all deep penetration missions beyond fighter escort range until P-51 Mustang long-range escorts become available. Priority: accelerate P-51 deployment to provide escort coverage throughout mission profile. Reality: our pre-war doctrine that bomber defensive firepower would enable unescorted operations has been proven incorrect by combat experience. Strategic bombing campaign requires fighter escort to achieve sustainable loss rates. This suspension validated German commanders' initial assessment that daylight strategic bombing was impractical. Luftwaffe had demonstrated that concentrated fighter opposition could inflict losses that made strategic bombing unsustainable, regardless of bombers' defensive firepower or formation tactics. 1944. Introduction of long-range P-51 Mustang escorts in early 1944 transformed strategic bombing campaign from unsustainable attrition to effective sustained operations. 8th Air Force Operations Summary covering January-June 1944 documented transformation. With P-51 escort coverage now available for entire mission profile, bomber loss rates have declined from 20+% for unescorted missions to 5 to 7% for escorted missions. This reduction makes strategic bombing campaign sustainable. January-June 1944, 30,000 plus bomber sorties flown, 1,500 bombers lost, representing 5% loss rate, 90,000 tons bombs dropped. At 5% loss rate, statistical crew survival probability for 25 mission tour is approximately 29%, still dangerous but no longer mathematically certain death. P-51 escorts provided protection that bomber defensive firepower couldn't achieve. According to tactical analysis, P-51s engaged German fighters before they reach bomber formations, preventing massed attacks that previously overwhelmed defensive firepower. P-51s pursue German fighters that break through initial screen, preventing coordinated attacks from multiple axes. P-51s have performance advantage over German fighters at most altitudes, enabling them to dominate air combat. Result: German fighters are destroyed, damaged, or forced to disengage before pressing attacks to lethal range. Bombers still face losses from flak and fighters that penetrate escort screen, but loss rates are sustainable rather than catastrophic. German fighter losses increased correspondingly. According to Luftwaffe report dated May 1944, American long-range fighter escorts have transformed aerial combat over Germany. Previously, Luftwaffe fighters enjoyed advantage during bomber attack phase when bombers were unescorted. Now, American fighters escort throughout mission, making every interception attempt potentially fatal for our fighters. Result: Luftwaffe is suffering unsustainable pilot losses. Experienced pilots are being killed faster than replacements can be trained. Fighter force effectiveness is declining, creating downward spiral. Fewer fighters mean less effective bomber interceptions, which mean more successful bombing raids, which mean more damage to aviation production facilities, which mean fewer fighters available. This cycle is unsustainable. By June 1944, D-Day, Allied air forces had achieved air superiority over Europe. According to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Air Assessment, strategic bombing campaign combined with fighter operations have reduced Luftwaffe effectiveness by approximately 70% compared to 1943 levels. German fighter force has been attrited through sustained combat. German aviation production has been disrupted through bombing. German fuel production has been severely damaged, eliminating fuel for pilot training, reducing pilot quality. Result: Allied forces will enjoy air superiority during Normandy invasion, enabling close air support and preventing German air interference with landing operations. August 1943 to May 1945.
Over 21 months from First Schweinfurt through German surrender, strategic bombing campaign dropped massive tonnage on German targets, creating destruction that transformed European cities. Statistical summary of 8th Air Force operations 1943-1945, documented campaign scale. Total sorties, 340,000 bomber sorties plus 260,000 fighter sorties. Total bomb tonnage, 692,000 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs. Targets, 952 major industrial facilities, 305 rail yards, 93 airfields, 46 oil refineries, and area bombing of 58 major cities. Results: German industrial production severely disrupted, particularly in aviation, petroleum, and transportation sectors.
German cities sustained extensive damage with 80+% destruction in some urban areas. Most dramatic destruction occurred in major cities. According to U.S. strategic bombing survey conducted after war, Hamburg, 50% of city destroyed, 40,000 civilians killed July 1943 firestorm. Dresden, 40% destroyed, estimated 25,000 killed February 1945 raids. Berlin, 33% destroyed through sustained 1943 to 1945 bombing. Cologne, 70% destroyed. Total German civilian deaths from Allied bombing estimated 300,000, 600,000 killed, with range reflecting uncertainty about casualties in final war months. Effectiveness debate emerged immediately after war and continues today. U.S.
Strategic bombing. Survey's conclusions were mixed. Strategic bombing made substantial contribution to Allied victory, but did not by itself force German surrender. Key findings: German war production continued increasing until mid-1944, despite sustained bombing demonstrating that dispersal and underground facilities maintained production. German morale did not collapse despite city destruction. Bombing may have stiffened rather than weakened civilian resistance. Most effective bombing targeted specific sectors, particularly oil production and transportation. Least effective bombing was area attacks on cities, which killed civilians without corresponding military advantage. Overall assessment: strategic bombing was a necessary component of Allied strategy, but not sufficient to win war without ground campaigns. Critics argued resources devoted to bombing should have been allocated differently. According to 1946 critique by military analyst, strategic bombing campaign consumed vast resources that could have accelerated war's end if deployed elsewhere. Production of 12,731 B-17s and 18,188 B-24s required industrial capacity that could have produced tanks, artillery, ships. Training 200,000 plus bomber crew members required personnel who could have served in ground forces. Loss of 26% of bomber crew members, killed or captured, represented waste of trained personnel that ground forces desperately needed. Alternative: reduce bombing campaign, redeploy resources to ground forces. Accept longer timeline for ground campaigns, but reduce overall casualties by avoiding high bomber loss rates. Defenders argued strategic bombing was essential. According to official Air Force history, strategic bombing forced Germany to divert resources to air defense that otherwise would have been used on eastern and western fronts. Germany deployed 1,000 plus personnel in air defense, including flak gunners,
fighter pilots, support personnel. Germany produced thousands of fighters for homeland defense that could have been deployed against Soviet or Western Allied air forces at fronts. Germany dispersed production underground, requiring resources that could have increased production if concentrated in above-ground facilities. These diversions weakened German ground forces, enabling faster Soviet and Western advances. Strategic bombing didn't win war alone, but made ground campaigns more effective by weakening German ability to resist. Statistics documenting American bomber crew casualties revealed sustained attrition that created a generation of combat veterans who survived mathematically improbable odds. Casualty analysis for 8th Air Force bomber operations 1942-1945. Total bomber crew members, approximately 200,000 served. Casualties, 26,000 killed in action, 28,000 wounded, 21,000 prisoners of war, 125,000 survived tour of duty. Casualty rate, 26% killed, 30% captured or wounded, 44% survived unharmed. These rates varied by period, with pre-escort era 1942 early 1944 showing 40+% killed versus escort era 1944-1945 showing 15% killed, demonstrating impact of fighter protection on survival. Individual crew member probability of completing 25 mission tour varied dramatically by mission era and target. According to probability analysis, during unescorted deep penetration era, August-October 1943, statistical survival probability for 25 mission tour was approximately 3% given 20+% loss rate per mission. During early escort era, January-June 1944, probability increased to 25% given 7 to 10% loss rates. During late war era, July 1944-May 1945, probability reached 60% given sub 5% loss rates. Overall average across entire campaign, approximately 35% of crews starting tours completed 25 missions without being killed or captured. Psychological impact was severe. According to post-war psychiatric assessment, bomber crew members experienced sustained stress from flying through flak knowing each burst could be fatal, watching adjacent aircraft explode killing crew members, sustained exposure to death, creating expectation that survival was improbable, inability to influence outcomes because bomber formations had to maintain position regardless of threats, survivor guilt after completing tours when many comrades died. Post-war consequences, high rates of anxiety disorders, depression, alcohol abuse, difficulty adjusting to civilian life, reluctance to discuss experiences because civilian population couldn't comprehend combat intensity. Personal accounts documented psychological toll. Lieutenant Robert Morgan, who commanded Memphis Bell, 1st B-17 to complete 25 mission tour, stated in memoir, "Every mission we flew, I calculated probability we wouldn't return. We watched aircraft explode, watched parachutes deploy, watched aircraft go down without parachutes, meaning crew died instantly. After each mission, we counted missing aircraft. Crews that had been flying with us that morning were gone by evening. We knew statistically most of us would die. Completing 25 missions felt like cheating fate. Survivor guilt was overwhelming. Why did I survive when better men died?" That question haunted me for decades. B-17, Flying Fortress characteristics that enabled sustained strategic bombing campaign demonstrated that structural toughness and defensive firepower could partially compensate for vulnerability inherent in bombing missions over defended territory. Technical specifications for B-17G, final production variant, documented capabilities. Crew, 10, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, 4 gunners. Armament, 13 50 caliber machine guns, 2 in nose, 2 in top turret, 2 in ball turret, 2 waist positions, 2 in tail turret, 1 in radio compartment, 2 cheek positions. Bomb load,
4,000, 8,000 pounds, depending on mission range.
Maximum speed, 287 mph. Service ceiling, 35,000 feet. Range, 2,000 miles. Armor, extensive armor protection for crew positions plus self-sealing fuel tanks. Weight, 65,500 pounds, maximum takeoff weight. 13 machine guns represented maximum defensive armament practically achievable. According to engineering analysis, each 50 caliber gun with ammunition weighs approximately 400 pounds, including mounting and feed mechanism. 13 guns total approximately 5,200 pounds, 8% of maximum takeoff weight devoted to defensive armament. This represents practical limit because additional guns would reduce bomb load or fuel capacity, eliminating mission effectiveness. Trade-off: heavy defensive armament provides protection but reduces offensive capability. Assessment: 13 guns is optimal balance between defense and offense for strategic bombing mission profile. Structural toughness became legendary. Crews returning with catastrophic damage demonstrated B-17's ability to sustain damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. Famous examples documented in mission reports included B-17 42-30255 returned with tail section nearly severed by cannon fire, with tail gunner still alive in disconnected tail controlling aircraft through emergency cable connections. B-17 41-24485 collided mid-air with German fighter severing 6 feet of left wingtip but continued flying to base. B-17 42-31023 suffered direct flak hit on number 3 engine, causing explosive failure that destroyed engine but left wing structure intact, allowing return on 3 engines. Combat film analysis showed why structural toughness mattered. According to analysis, German fighter attacks typically achieved multiple hits on B-17s, but many damaged aircraft remained flyable. B-17's rugged construction, heavy wing spars, redundant control systems, radial engines that continue operating despite cylinder damage, allowed aircraft to absorb battle damage that would down lighter bombers. Additionally, crew armor and self-sealing fuel tanks reduced casualties from hits that penetrated aircraft. Result: while 26% of bomber crews were killed, 44% survived tours, demonstrating that aircraft's protective features saved lives even when damaged. Comparison between American daylight precision bombing and British night area bombing revealed both approaches contributed to German defeat through different mechanisms, with neither achieving decisive results independently. Combined Allied Air Forces assessment dated 1946 documented operational differences. According to assessment, American 8th Air Force conducted daylight precision bombing, 340,000 sorties, delivering 692,000 tons, primarily against industrial targets. Losses: 60,500 bombers destroyed, 26,000 crew killed, representing 13% of 200,000 who served. Accuracy: approximately 30% of bombs within 1,000 feet of aiming point. British RAF Bomber Command conducted night area bombing, 390,000 sorties delivering 955,000 tons against German cities. Losses: 8,300 bombers destroyed, 55,000 crew killed, representing 28% of 200,000 who served. Accuracy: approximately 10% within 2,000 feet of aiming point. These statistics showed British dropped more tonnage but sustained higher casualties while achieving lower accuracy, reflecting trade-offs between daylight precision and night operations. According to analysis, American operations achieved better accuracy, allowing targeting of specific facilities, but required fighter escort to achieve sustainable losses. British operations achieved concealment through darkness, allowing operations without escort, but sacrificed accuracy, making destruction of specific facilities difficult. Neither approach was superior across all criteria, each optimized for different priorities. Effectiveness analysis examined whether each achieved stated objectives. According to assessment, American precision bombing aimed to destroy specific facilities, creating production bottlenecks. Success varied. Oil refineries effectively destroyed with synthetic fuel production, reduced 90% by 1945. Ball bearing plants damaged, but production continued through dispersal. Aircraft factories sustained damage, but production increased until mid-1944. Overall, precision bombing disrupted petroleum sector, but didn't achieve complete collapse, pre-war doctrine predicted.
British area bombing aimed to destroy worker housing and break civilian morale. Physical destruction. Major cities sustained 30 to 70% destruction, hundreds of thousands killed. Morale effects. German morale didn't collapse. Bombing may have stiffened resistance. Overall, area bombing created massive destruction, but didn't achieve political collapse theorists anticipated. Strategic Bombing Survey conclusions acknowledged contributions while identifying limitations. According to survey, combined bombing made substantial contribution but didn't force surrender as pre-war theorists predicted. German production continued increasing until mid-1944, despite sustained bombing demonstrating dispersal and repair maintained output.
Civilian morale didn't break, demonstrating populations endure bombing when political system provides no dissent outlet. Most effective, petroleum attacks crippling armored and air operations, transportation attacks disrupting logistics. Least effective, indiscriminate area attacks killing civilians without military advantage. Overall, bombing was necessary component consuming German resources, but not sufficient without ground invasions physically conquering territory. German perspective documented bombing forced resource diversions, weakening ground forces. According to analysis, bombing forced Germany to deploy approximately 1,000 personnel in air defense, 10,000 anti-aircraft guns that could have served as anti-tank weapons at fronts, 40% of fighter production for homeland defense rather than frontline support. These diversions weakened ground capabilities, making Allied advances easier. Additionally, dispersal to underground facilities reduced production efficiency. Net effect: bombing contributed by forcing resource allocations away from direct military operations. B-17's strategic bombing campaign revealed fundamental truths about relationship between pre-war doctrine and combat reality, about costs of strategic warfare, about necessity of combined arms approach, and about moral complexities of targeting decisions in total war. First truth: doctrine developed in peacetime requires validation through combat experience, with willingness to revise doctrine when reality contradicts assumptions. Pre-war strategic bombing doctrine assumed bombers could fight through to targets using defensive firepower, making fighter escort unnecessary. Combat experience 1942-1943 demonstrated this assumption was wrong. Unescorted bombers sustained losses that were unsustainable regardless of defensive armament or formation tactics. Air Corps initially resisted revising doctrine because institutional commitment made admitting error difficult. Only after catastrophic Schweinfurt losses forced suspension of deep penetration missions did Air Corps accept that doctrine required revision. Revised doctrine emphasizing fighter escort achieved sustainable operations, validating importance of adapting doctrine to combat reality rather than persisting with failed assumptions.
Second truth: strategic warfare imposes costs, both military and civilian, that exceed tactical warfare, creating moral questions about whether strategic effects justify casualties inflicted. Strategic bombing campaign killed 26,000 American airmen and 300,000 German civilians while disrupting German industrial production, contributing to Allied victory. Whether these deaths justified strategic effects achieved remains contested. Defenders argue strategic bombing shortened war-saving lives overall. Critics argue resources devoted to bombing could have achieved faster victory if deployed to ground forces. This debate demonstrates that strategic warfare's indirect effects make cost-benefit analysis complicated compared to tactical warfare, where effects are immediate and measurable.
Third truth: no single approach achieves decisive results. Combined arms integration, where multiple capabilities reinforce each other, produces effects exceeding some of individual contributions. Strategic bombing alone didn't defeat Germany. Ground campaigns were necessary. Ground campaigns alone would have taken longer without strategic bombing weakening German production and forcing resource diversion to air defense. Fighter escorts alone couldn't achieve strategic effects. They enabled bombers to reach targets, but bombers delivered destructive effects. Combined bomber-fighter ground operations created synergistic effects that individual approaches couldn't achieve. This demonstrates principle that modern warfare requires integration of multiple capabilities rather than relying on single decisive capability. Fourth truth: technological advantages don't guarantee victory. Defenders adapt, developing countermeasures that negate advantages, requiring constant innovation to maintain offensive effectiveness. B-17's defensive firepower initially surprised German fighters, but within months, Luftwaffe developed tactics exploiting weaknesses: frontal attacks targeting weak nose armament, rocket attacks from beyond gun range, coordinated attacks overwhelming defensive firepower. Americans responded with chin turrets adding nose armament, fighter escorts protecting against massed attacks, improved formation tactics. This cycle of innovation and counter-innovation demonstrates that technological advantage is temporary, requiring continuous innovation to maintain effectiveness. Fifth truth: survivors carry psychological costs from sustained combat that aren't captured in casualty statistics. Post-war society must acknowledge that surviving combat doesn't mean escaping combat's effects. 44% of bomber crew members survived their tours, but many carried psychological burdens from watching comrades die, from accepting that statistical probability favored death, from survivor guilt questioning why they lived when others died. These psychological costs weren't acknowledged adequately in post-war period because society expected veterans to resume normal lives without support for processing trauma. Modern understanding of PTSD shows that combat survival doesn't equal combat recovery, and that societies must provide support for veterans processing combat experiences. Curtis LeMay's journey from colonel leading Schweinfurt raids to general commanding firebombing of Japan demonstrated both strategic bombing's effectiveness and moral complications. His willingness to accept catastrophic casualties at Schweinfurt, believing strategic effects justified losses, made him effective commander by military metrics, but created moral questions about targeting decisions that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians in Japan. His acknowledgement that losers of wars get tried as criminals reflected understanding that strategic bombing pushed boundaries of acceptable warfare, with justification depending on victory rather than inherent morality. B-17, flying fortress itself, mocked initially by German commanders as too slow and vulnerable for deep penetration missions, then feared as symbol of Allied industrial might raining destruction on German cities, proved that sustained mass production plus tactical innovation plus combined arms integration could overcome defenders' advantages. German commanders' transformation from mockery to fear occurred not through single decisive engagement, but through sustained campaign, where American industrial capacity produced bomber forces that German defenses couldn't destroy faster than Americans could replace them. By war's end, with 12,231 B-17s produced, 692,000 tons bombs dropped, 6,500 bombers lost, 26,000 crew members killed, and German industrial capacity reduced by approximately 50% according to strategic bombing surveys. the mathematics proving that strategic bombing was costly but effective contribution to Allied victory had been written. Those mathematics showed neither that strategic bombing was war-winning silver bullet that pre-war theorists promised, nor that it was futile waste as critics claimed, but rather that it was expensive complement to ground operations that contributed meaningfully to victory while consuming resources and lives whose alternative employment remains debated 8 decades later. The German cities that experienced strategic bombing, Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, Cologne, remain physical evidence of bombing campaign scale, with destruction patterns still visible in urban geography and in preserved buildings, showing battle damage. German survivors who experienced bombing and American crews who delivered it carry memories that shape their understanding of warfare's human costs beyond strategic calculations about industrial capacity destroyed and missions completed. And historians analyzing campaign continue debating whether effects achieved justified costs sustained, demonstrating that strategic warfare's complexity makes definitive judgments impossible when costs and benefits span military, civilian, industrial, moral, and psychological dimensions.